Catholics don't know Scripture. How many times have I heard somebody say that? You know, somebody said one day, he said, you know, the Catholic Church doesn't even teach the Bible. I've heard that many times. Well, more times when I was in the oil field than now, but it's still something that people say. It's still something that's out there. And I'm going to dispel that as being false. Because you see, on Sunday, our Sunday readings go in a 3-year cycle, right? So in 3 years, you're going to hear the majority of the Bible. I'm going to say 90%, but I don't think that number's exactly correct. But in 3 years, we hear the majority of the Bible. We have 3 readings at every Sunday Mass. And we get to listen to the Scriptures. So I'm going to say that, I venture to say, that someone who has reached my maturity, my age, or above, has heard the Bible more often than we would think that we imagine. The problem is that we're not trained to defend our faith. We're not trained to use Scripture to challenge people. We use Scripture to guide our lives. And that's the difference. But just to give you some of the examples, when I was in the oil field, I was in a discussion. A guy knew that I was a deacon, and he walked up to me one day and he says, you know what? He says, you know what I don't understand? He said, the Scriptures definitely say, call no man father, and you Catholics, y'all call y'all priest father. Now, I could argue that with using Scripture, and use Scripture to defend the Catholic Church's position. What's the next verse? What's the verse after that? But I rather sarcasm. It's out of character for me to use sarcasm, but I would rather use sarcasm sometimes. So I asked the guy, I said, well, let me ask you this question. I said, what is next to your dad's name on your birth certificate? He said, what does that have to do with anything? I said, that's not the question. What is next to your dad's name on your birth certificate? He said, well, I imagine it says father. I said, do you have a problem with that? He said, well, no. I said, the Scripture says call no man father, not no priest. So you should have an issue with that. So I don't think that's what it means. Of course, he walked away and he called me a hater. That's kind of a badge of honor sometimes. But I have had those challenges, right? And I think that most Catholics can understand more about Scripture than we would like to let on that we know. I met a guy a few weeks ago, and we were sitting down talking, and he wanted to try to challenge me, and he says, you know what? He says, I think most people read the Bible the wrong way. So I took his challenge, and I said, I agree with you. He didn't know what to say next. I said, I agree with you that most people read the Scriptures the wrong way, because sometimes we read the Scriptures, and it's beautiful to do it, to listen to the stories being retold. Just to listen to what happened 2,000 years ago. And how awesome are those stories. But you see, every one of those stories has a message for us today. Because the Scriptures are alive. It's not just a history book that talks about what happened in the past. It's something that's teaching us about something in today. So you see, sometimes it's not about reading the stories to remember what happened in the past. Sometimes it's about reading the story to listen to the message. In one of those conversations, a guy walked up, we were going back and forth, and my sarcasm was a little more than his, and he felt like he was losing, and he just looked at me and he says, you know, he says, I only know one man that walked on water, and you're not him. I said, you're right, but you're wrong also. And he said, what do you mean? I said, there was 2 men that walked on water. Go back and read the Scriptures again. See, Peter stepped out of that boat. Peter stepped out of that boat and he walked on the water until he took his eyes off of Jesus. You see, we have to really listen to what it's saying, right? And sometimes the message in this gospel is about not taking our eyes off of Jesus, right? When the storms of life start to blow around us, it's to continue to focus on Jesus. You see, but Peter stepped out of that boat. There were 12 men in that boat. And Jesus only called one out. You see, he called all 12 of them to be his disciples. He calls each and every one of us to be a disciple, to go out and be a witness of who Christ is in our life, so that we can bring the world to Christ, to bring the world back to him. But he only called one out of the boat. So I have to ask that question. If you were the one that he called out, would you have the courage to step out of that boat and walk on water? See, Peter did. But then he noticed the wind and the waves, and he saw all of the turmoil going on around him. And he took his focus off of Jesus, and he began to sink. And then he cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached up and grabbed him and saved him from sinking in the storm. You see, this is one of those times that we can take a lesson from Peter. Not the part of taking our eyes off of Jesus, but the fact that when we start to sink in the storms of life, when we get that diagnosis, or we have turmoil in our families, or we just look around at the world today, to call out to Jesus, "Lord, save me." To call out to Jesus, to focus on Jesus, "Lord, save me," and he will help us to get back in the boat. They said there were 11 other men in that boat. Would they have all been able to walk on water? We don't know, because Jesus didn't call them out. Peter volunteered, but Jesus didn't ask the rest to do what Peter did. See, sometimes in our life that the voice of God is not going to be thunderous. It's not going to be like we believe Paul was knocked off of a horse and his conversion started from there. That first reading tells us that sometimes the voice of God is going to be in that small, gentle sound. A few years ago, working in hospice, I found a whole bunch of small wind chimes, and I gave that to the staff with that scripture reading from the first reading, to listen to the voice of God in the little gentle breeze. You see, sometimes God is asking us to be silent so that we can hear his voice. But sometimes silence is not enough. You see, sometimes when in the world today, because everyone is way too busy about everything else, but sometimes silence is not enough. Sometimes we need to learn to be still so that we can hear God's voice. Sometimes we need to learn to be still so that we can focus on him who came to save us. You see, we ask ourselves today, if God called me out of the boat, would I have the courage to walk on water? Would I have the faith to trust him? Would I trust him enough that I could focus on him and not sink into the waves and the storms of life? To live our life focused on Jesus Christ. And when those waves and those storms and those things in life cause us to sink, can we listen to Peter and follow his example and call out, "Lord, save me"? Do we trust Jesus to save us?